Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 108, Grunwald, Tannenberg, Zalgiris. Following the agreement of Vilnius-Radom, one area took priority for Jogaila and Vytautas in foreign affairs. The defeat at the Vorskla had ended the southern expansion. Friendly relations with Moscow ruled out aggression in the east. But the question of the Teutonic Order was still a source of concern for both Lithuania and Poland. Poland and the Order had mostly been at peace for the second half of the 14th century, but minor conflicts had been cropping up since the succession struggle that brought Jogaila to the throne. First, as we've seen throughout, we have to always assume that every player was absolutely opportunistic and would attempt to play its advantage any time its neighbours were distracted. This lay behind a lot of the constant low-level frontier skirmishing going on. However, relations between Poland and the Order had taken a more serious downturn when Władysław of Opel pawned his castle at Dobrzyn to the Order in 1381 without asking Jogaila first. The castle was a key defensive point up the Vistula River from Thorn, and Jogaila quickly mobilized to seize it back. But the following year, encouraged by Sigismund of Luxembourg, who saw himself as having lost the throne of Poland, the Order occupied most of Dobrzyn, which Władysław had pawned to them for 50,000 florins. This occupation provoked considerable anger throughout Poland. Initially, this had little practical result, since the Małopolska Szlachta, who had significant influence in court, were more interested in what was going on in the east. However, as Jogaila gradually built up his own network of allies and clients, the opinion of those who shared his hostility to the Order began to gather more weight. For Vytautas, there was the Samogitian issue. If you recall, he had ceded the region to the Order under the Salin Agreement, with the intention of buying security for his rear while he campaigned in the south. Now that need had fallen away, and with it went his motivation to comply with the treaty. The agreement required Lithuania to send Samogitians who tried to flee to Lithuania back to the Order, who needed them to work the land. Vytautas stopped doing this, claiming that the Samogitians were free men, not serfs, and therefore not covered by the agreement. Meanwhile, in Samogitia, the Order was vigorously enforcing demands for the peasantry, who had indeed previously considered themselves free, to perform labour for the Order. As the resentment grew, rebellious peasants looked to Lithuania for support, and, contrary to his agreement, Vytautas encouraged them and provided it. In the summer of 1401, the situation flared up into a small war, with both sides carrying out fairly ineffective raiding for a couple of years. While nothing in particular came of this, it was yet more of the endless frontier skirmishing that characterized the region. The war caused the Order some concern. While there was still a solid majority of the Szlachta against war with Poland, Jogaila had sent 1,000 Polish knights to support Vytautas, showing the increasing closeness between Poland and Lithuania, and raising the prospect of the cousins cooperating against the Order. In an attempt to appear to allay these concerns, Jogaila had Vytautas swear a public oath not to enter into any agreements with the Order without his knowledge and approval. Under the influence of these conciliatory moves, an agreement was concluded to end the war. The Order returned Dobshin, receiving compensation well below what it had paid. It got to keep Samogitia in exchange for expelling Jogaila and agreeing not to harbour any other relatives of Jogaila who rebelled against him. As we've already seen many times, Vytautas could always be relied on to follow his own interests, and soon he was in fact entering into a new agreement with the Order without Jogaila's knowledge or approval, declaring that they would be allies against all enemies except the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire, and Jogaila. This was the end result of the fight with Moscow over Smolensk we mentioned previously. Jogaila did not let this slide. Vytautas was summoned to see him in Kamieniec, way down south in Podylia. In public, Vytautas had to pledge his loyalty once again and to demonstrate it by withdrawing from all treaties contrary to Jogaila's interests. In exchange, Jogaila, who had previously refused to help Vytautas with his Ruthenian problems, provided Polish support for his campaigns in Smolensk and Pskov. In 1408, Vytautas marched against Moscow with a Lithuanian and Polish army, concluding the agreement that restored the peace with Moscow. Vytautas' campaign against Pskov also broke the Salin Agreement, which had called for the parties, Lithuania and the Order, not to expand their spheres of influence. In fact, the Order had good cause for concern. Not only did the gradual transformation of the Union into something real, with cooperating armies, transform the situation they had been facing over the previous decades, where they were regularly able to play off competing parties within Lithuania, never mind between Poland and Lithuania, it was also becoming undeniable that, this time, Lithuania's conversion was real. As the first decade of the 15th century approached its end, the Catholic Church had established a clear framework for operating across Lithuania, and claims that the conversion was only opportunistic were looking increasingly shaky. There was no real resistance to Catholicism at an elite level, and the religion was spreading steadily among the ordinary people. The same could not be said of Samogitia, which was under the control of the Order. There, missionary work was slow going, with resistance to Christianization regularly rising to the level of violence. At the same time, the Christianization process was another factor that put Poland firmly on Lithuania's side. The Polish Church was running the show, and it forcefully opposed any claims by the Order, casting doubt on its work. Beyond the simple practical implications of the Order versus Poland and Lithuania together, meaning the Order was almost certainly the weaker side, these factors also cut into the Order's reason for existence as such. There could be no more crusading against a Christian enemy, and that meant an end to all the international support that had underwritten the Order since it first turned to the Baltic. Forces in Poland were well aware of this. The Polish Church had long been hostile to the Order, partly because the Order had taken lands that had previously been in the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of Polish bishops. There had been more accommodation from secular nobles, but now Jogaila was steadily advancing his own allies to positions of power. The Order's initial reaction to the Union had been to try to push their defences forward through defensive acquisitions before a genuine alliance against them could form, especially taking Dobrzyn and Samogitia. It also purchased the Neumark from Sigismund of Luxembourg, which gave it a land bridge to the Holy Roman Empire and split Pomerelia and Wielkopolska. These acquisitions created new border hotspots. In 1409, the Order seized ships carrying grain from Poland to Lithuania, claiming that they were supplying weapons to Samogitia. This provided Poland with a pretext for war, but it was probably not critical by this time. Jogaila had been steadily building towards action in any case. He had the support of the Szlachta, and he had placed his own men in most of the senior offices across the country. The time for action had arrived. For the first time in 40 years, the king issued an order to raise a special tax on the nobility. In addition to that fixed charge we discussed previously that had been agreed back during the contested successions. There was no difficulty collecting. He wanted to raise 50,000 florins, but he received 100,000. Part was used for the repurchase of Dobrzyn. The tax and repurchase increased hostility to the Order across Poland. In December 1408, Jogaila and Vytautas met in Nawachrudak. There's no surviving record of what they discussed or decided, but historians believe that it's likely that a decision was made to provoke a new rebellion in Samogitia. There's a consensus that the relationship between the cousins at this point meant that it was not probable that Vytautas would have done this on his own. In May 1409, Samogitia rose up, taking the Order's governor completely by surprise. The Order's intelligence reports throughout the summer claimed that Vytautas and Jogaila were on the outs, locked in a variety of disputes, which appears to be the result of a highly successful misinformation campaign. Actually, Jogaila was backing Vytautas from the beginning. In early summer, he called a general assembly where the Szlachta backed his plans and agreed to send an embassy to the Order. Negotiations began in Marienburg in late July. The Polish delegation accepted the Order's request that Vytautas be asked to withdraw from Samogitia, where he'd already begun placing his own administrators, but it rejected a request that Poland remain neutral in the event of hostilities. According to Długosz, the Polish delegation told the Order that Lithuanians' enemies were Poland's, and that if the Order attacked Lithuania, Poland would take up arms against them. Although some historians consider that this was invented for literary effect. Rather than not attacking Lithuania, the result was that the Order declared war on Poland as well, with the Grand Master stating that Poland had left him no choice. Jogaila had therefore successfully manoeuvred the Order into being the aggressor, which would be to Poland's advantage in the rest of Catholic Europe. Poland needed to score some points in this regard because the Order was not the only side that had problems over the justification for its war. Samogitiya, as we've noted, was still pagan, and supporting pagans against Catholics was just as much bad optics as conducting a crusade against Catholics. The Lithuanian army also had a strong Ruthenian Orthodox contingent and Muslim Tatar auxiliaries. It was therefore very important for wider public opinion that Poland was not seen as starting the war with schismatic and infidel allies against fellow Catholics. The Order concluded a formal agreement with Sigismund of Luxembourg, under which he agreed to provide 10,000 troops if the Poles and Lithuanians used pagan forces against the Knights. By October, after Poland had recaptured Bydgoszcz, Sigismund's brother, King Wenzel of Bohemia, also got involved. He mediated a truce, but was so one-sided in the judgment he prepared for the peace talks that the Poles walked out. In 1410, the Holy Roman Emperor died, opening up a succession process in which the various electors, princes of the German lands, chose his replacement. Sigismund had been expecting to get the job, but ended up losing to his cousin. While the Order's German allies were distracted, Jogaila and Vytautas undermined their support from Silesia and the Pomeranians. Mazovia joined them, fulfilling its duties as a Polish vassal. Vytautas pulled off a major diplomatic success by getting the Livonian Order to agree to a truce. This left the Order facing Poland and Lithuania, without the option for diversionary action from Livonia in the Lithuanian rear. All this severely hit the Order's plans for an invasion. Propaganda against Lithuania's pagans produced limited results, and the numbers of foreign volunteers arriving in the Baltic continued to decline. The Order was forced to rely on recruiting mercenaries. The Order had vast military experience and well-practiced logistics. Its foundries were churning out cannon, and despite the issues, it was assembling an impressive force. But Jogaila and Vytautas were doing better. When the Grand Master's intelligence brought word of the size of the opposing army, his first thought was to break the truce and launch a surprise attack before they were ready. When that proved impossible, he tried to bring in new mediators from Hungary. They were too late. The Polish army crossed the Vistula using a pontoon bridge. They rendezvoused with the Lithuanians at Chervinsk. On 9th July 1410, they crossed the border, marching towards Marienburg. Finding the way blocked, they turned east. On 15th of July, they reached the Order's army, deployed in the hills between the villages of Grunwald and Tannenberg. The numbers given in all the chronicles are generally regarded as unreliable, but there is an agreement that Poland and Lithuania significantly outnumbered the Order, and that it was a large battle by the standards of European armies of the time. Estimated numbers range between 12 and 20,000 for the Order and 16 to 30,000 for Poland and Lithuania. Both armies were based around heavily armoured knights. The Order had brought some field artillery, and the Lithuanians had their Tatar auxiliaries. The Lithuanians engaged first and then withdrew after heavy fighting. There's been some debate over whether this was a deliberate manoeuvre, with one contemporary source stating that the Tatars led the withdrawal. It could have been the case, after all. It would not be so strange for Vytautas to remember the manoeuvre that had led to his defeat at the Vorskla, and to try it against someone else. However, the Order did not break ranks to give chase, and the Lithuanians returned to the battle. In the end, there were no special tactics or lucky coincidences. It simply came down to Poland and Lithuania having the biggest army. The Order was smashed. All of their senior officers were killed. Of the 270 Teutonic knights who rode to the battle, just 59 returned. The result was a bombshell for Europe. It was completely unexpected, following 2 centuries of the Order slowly but steadily expanding, and heralded the arrival of a new major power. Długosz and other historians following him have criticized Jogaila for not marching straight to Marienburg to finish the Order off, but this was not, in fact, realistic. The army was exhausted after the hard-fought battle and could not have carried on another 120 kilometers to the city, which still had very well-organized defenses. However, across the Order's territory, towns expelled their garrisons and welcomed the Poles, including Elbing, Thorn, Kulm, and Danzig. The bishops of Ermland, Pomezania, and Kulm swore allegiance to Jogaila. The size of the victory woke up some of the Order's allies. Livonia sent 3,000 men to Königsberg. More European mercenaries signed up and arrived in Prussia. Meanwhile, the Lithuanians went home. On 1st of February 1411, a peace was concluded at Thorn. Samogitia was returned to Lithuania, although only for the life of Vytautas. Dobrzyn was returned to Poland without any conditions, and the Order paid Jogaila 100,000 groszy to ransom prisoners. Although these achievements were fairly limited, the conflict has become known as the Great War, and what the Germans call the Battle of Tannenberg, the Poles the Battle of Grunwald, and the Lithuanians the Battle of Zalgiris, has gone down in the popular mind as one of the turning points in European history. Modern scholarship tends to downplay its importance, given that the Order remained in power. But it's not going too far to say that it did mark a shift in the balance of power. There will be more wars between the Order and Poland-Lithuania over the rest of the 15th century, and even if none of the individual battles are as disastrous for the Order as Tannenberg, the story is one of their defeat and steady decline. The Order began the 15th century with 700 brother knights in Prussia, along with their servants, staff, and lay members, thousands of people altogether. By the end of the century, only 55 will be left. Its castles and convents will stand empty. It began the century with healthy finances, able to purchase land, build castles, equip and hire armies. Over the century, its income collapses, and the order is forced to debase its currency. As the crusade comes to an end, the oligarchical regime of the order becomes hard to sustain. Livonia has its own interests and gradually goes its own way. In Prussia, the landed class, later to develop into the Prussian Junkers, starts to assert its own interests. For Poland and Lithuania, the opposite was true, especially for Lithuania. For a century, the order had been gradually pushing them back away from the Baltic. The Lithuanian expansion east and south had been partly due to moving away from the German threat. Raiding had been nearly constant. For Poland, the latter half of the 14th century had been more peaceful, but only due to the settlements that had followed previous order encroachment taking Polish lands. Neither had individually been strong enough to decisively take on the Knights. Now that had changed. 25 years after Kreva, the union of Poland and Lithuania had finally borne fruit. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.